My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob and I had a tradition where right around New Year's, we would do an update of where we were and where we were going. I really liked doing that. It just kept podcast listeners in the loop. In my first year of doing the podcast on my own, I wanted to keep that tradition going. I know I sometimes haphazardly mention stuff in my personal life on the podcast, but I also know that fans of the podcast listen haphazardly. So I figured go ahead and do the update, continue the tradition during the New Year, update y'all on where things are at. So here's my shot at a one-man end of the year update podcast for end of 2023, beginning of 2024. Something weird happened May 23rd, 2023. I got 2 job offerings in a single day. Let me go back and explain. I defended my dissertation in November of 2021, and I checked out a bit. Not that I wasn't busy. I had y'all, of course, with the podcast, which was quite the handful. My wife and I had a baby. We made that baby about a month after I turned in the final draft of my dissertation. My second daughter was born late in 2022. That's been another handful. And I was doing some freelance journalism. In May, I published a 4,000-word piece that I'm very proud of. It's on Chinese espionage. Sadly, it's for the now defunct online publication, The China Project. Although that particular media outlet has gone under, I was really proud to have that out there. I'm doing some other work. As we speak, I have an article that is being prepared for publication in The Economist on Kung Fu in Africa. So hopefully by the time you hear this, that will be published. I was also working on a book, which I have alluded to on the podcast, though at that point I had not found a publisher or even a literary agent for it. All in all, I was pretty busy. In May in 2023, I was in Taiwan. The way I got there is actually interesting. At the very end of 2019, I got 2 grants to study museums in Taiwan. 2 grants from 2 different organizations. My dissertation was on museums in China and Taiwan, so it completely made sense. The only thing was I had to use that money during the year 2020. Originally, I'd planned to go to Taiwan in the summer of 2020, but guess what happened? COVID. So I had to put that off for several years, and then having a baby made things even more complicated. So I really wasn't able to go to Taiwan until this past year, 2023. But finally, I got the chance to use that pot of money and go to Taiwan. I went to a bunch of museums. And then on May 23rd of that year, I actually got 2 job offers. The first was from the University of Oregon. On the morning of May 23rd, an old professor of mine reached out to me. He said my old department, the East Asian Languages and Literature Department, had 2 professors who were sort of not teaching classes. I say sort of, I should probably qualify this. One of them was on sabbatical. One of them was not teaching many courses because he was doing some administrative work. If you do admin work in university, oftentimes you have to teach fewer courses, but then they have to find a way to make that up. So they asked me if I would be willing to cover 3 or 4 classes for them over the 2023-2024 year. At first I was going to say, no, not going to do it. But as I was taking the train from Taipei to Tainan, I thought about it, and something strange happened. I realized that although I have a lot of problems with academia and the way it's run, I really love teaching students, and that's something Rob and I talked about. Rob loves teaching. Me, I enjoyed teaching as well, never as much as Rob, but it's something that has stuck with me. One of the things I like most about academia is engaging with students. And as I was on that train from Taipei to Tainan, I found myself fantasizing about teaching, and fantasizing is the right word. I was thinking about, I could teach this text and this film and that film. Once I began ideating about what films and text I was going to teach, I realized that I would be stupid not to accept the offer. And that's what I did. I sent my former professor an email, said, yes, I'm game, let's talk. What I have been doing, I got the offer to teach 4 classes. All of these are classes that I had previously worked as a TA for. The 4 classes are Chinese film, which I just finished teaching, Chinese popular culture, which I'm going to be teaching in the winter quarter. And then in the spring quarter, I'm actually teaching 2 classes, Chinese narrative, which is just essentially anything that involves narrative in China's 3,500 years of writing. So basically anything I want. And then the other class is going to be on Taiwanese literature and film. As I mentioned, I have already taught one of those classes, the Chinese film class, and I'll have to say it's fun, but way more demanding than I was expecting. First off, as I mentioned before, I was a TA for this class and all of these classes. But when I was a TA, I would just teach 25 students per discussion section. Usually I would teach a total of 50 students, so 2 discussion sections a quarter. I'd have to do grading and attend the lectures, and I'd have a few other responsibilities. But when I was a TA, I looked at what my professors did, and I was like, I could do that. I could do what they do. It wouldn't be that much harder than what I'm doing already. Turns out it is much harder. To create a lecture, to actually teach a 100-person course, and except for the Taiwanese literature and film class, all of the classes I'm teaching are 100-person lectures. To create a lecture for these kinds of classes, you have to do so much work. You have to do so much content preparation. And my lecture is an hour and 20 minutes, but I normally just lecture for an hour. So I had to have an hour's worth of content prepared for 2 lectures a week. When I started out preparing for this, I went back and looked at the preparation work that I did as a TA. When I was a TA, I would write stuff down, and I thought that the prep work that I had done as a TA would get me halfway there. Initially, I expected that I could transform the preparation work that I had done for the classes I had taught as a TA and wiggle it around a little bit, add a few more things, and pretty easily, boom, I've got my lecture made up. No problem. Wrong. Nope. I had so much work to get my lectures ready, way more than I did as a TA. My prep work as a TA was of very little help. Of course, having been in the class and having seen the class taught a bit, that was super helpful. But as a TA, what I would do when I prepared for discussion section, I would just come into the discussion section having read the text, and I would have a list of questions to ask students about that particular text or film. These were meant to prompt discussion and lead students down a path to a deeper understanding of that text. And that's great for a discussion section. That really, really works. I still think that's the way to do a discussion section. You've got 25 students in that discussion section. When they're in lecture, they're not engaged. They're very passive. Some of them are more active than others, but inevitably, because you've got 100 people, speaking up is, first off, very intimidating. And second, there's just a quarter of as much time to speak up during a large lecture class. So having that discussion section where students can take the text and talk about it, take ownership over it, is really important. But a lot of what that involves is the TA getting out of the way, letting students go down rabbit holes, explore the text further. That has almost nothing to do with what you do as a professor when you have a lecture in a 100-person class. For a lecture, you just have to have so much information, so much content. As a discussant leader, you get out of the way. I have done really bad discussion sections. Most of them involved me talking too much and not allowing students to talk. But the dynamic is the exact reverse when you're doing a lecture. If the professor is talking, that's actually more of a good thing. Of course, you do want to make time for student questions and comments, but in general, in a good lecture, you are transmitting information from the stage to the students. I also was surprised at how much research I had to do to come up with a lecture. As y'all know, I'm pretty familiar with Chinese history, Chinese literature, Chinese film maybe a little bit less so, but still, I have a fairly broad foundation of knowledge on these topics. I thought, I'm not going to really have to do much research. Nope. I still had to do lots of research. I still had to nail down facts, and it was really time-consuming in a way that I did not expect. I had to do lots of reading. I just was not prepared in the way that I thought having TA'd on these classes before would prepare me. If you've not done it, there's no challenge like having to prepare a lecture for a 100-person class. It's so time-consuming, but also on the happier side, it's really, really rewarding. There's a saying, if you want to learn something, teach it. That's true. There's no better preparation for feeling like I had a grounding in these topics than preparing these lectures. I now can look back at these lectures and I feel bulletproof on these particular topics, whether it be a particular film or that film's location in Chinese history in general. I feel like a much stronger researcher, a much stronger advocate for getting people outside China to understand China better now that I have prepared these lectures and kind of gone through this process. And I should point out, I see that as the mission of this podcast, to help people outside of China better understand China, particularly through Chinese literature, but also history. Although I think Laszlo Montgomery's podcast is a better source for that. Still, I sort of covered that territory too. China is so poorly understood outside of China that there is this real need for someone who understands China, but can also speak to a broad non-Chinese audience. And I have listeners from Europe, North America, Southeast Asia, all over the place, and I hope to serve them with this dollop of knowledge about one of the world's most important countries, but also one of the world's most misunderstood countries. In other words, teaching so far has been a great, if very taxing experience. It's taxing both because I have to prepare the lectures, but also dealing with students is really taxing. I mean, one of the things I loved about being a teacher is having this one-on-one personal interaction with students. It's great. But as a professor, the dynamic is different. As a TA, whatever grade I gave students, that was not the final word. I was not where the buck stopped in terms of grading. Now I'm the instructor of record. I'm the person who gives the grade. There's a very different dynamic when you have that much power over students. And I'll have to say, I don't take any pleasure in giving grades. It's actually one of my least favorite parts of the experience with students. But there's also just a lot of other stuff. There's a constant stream of emails that you get from students. Sometimes it's really worthwhile. These are just small things that need to be addressed, but still they take time away from you. But other times it's just nonsense. I remember having several students ask me, when the final was. And beyond that, there's just a constant stream of fires that you have to be putting out as a professor. I'll give you one example. So my film class meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then there's a discussion section on Friday. I say that in the syllabus that class is mandatory, and I laid out an absence policy. But at the end of the quarter, I had 2 students email me on the last day of lecture, and they claimed that they did not realize that the discussion section was mandatory. Like I said, in my syllabus, I say that class is mandatory, but it was ambiguous as to whether or not that included discussion section. Just dealing with that, talking to administrators, it took several hours to put this fire out. And I was just so sapped from dealing with it. Until you have been a professor, you don't realize how much time dealing with these little things takes. They're tiny little time sucks that really add up. I thought I was only teaching 2 or 3 hours a week. I should be able to get a lot of stuff done in between, but I've had trouble getting as much as I wanted done. I'm working on some time management techniques to deal with that, but still, it's just, there are so many time sucks in a teaching job that you don't realize until you're in them. Now, that is my job at the UO, but I said I got 2 job offers on that day, May 23rd, 2023. I mentioned that I was in Taiwan at the time, doing research on Taiwanese museums. I got the job offer in an email that morning as I was traveling down to Tainan. That evening, I had dinner with the head of the Guoli Taiwan Wenshui Guan, the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. It was arranged very spur of the moment. I was very lucky to get to meet the head of that museum, Nikki Lin. We were talking. I told her what my research was, my background in Chinese literature, my podcast. And she just happened to have a grant that focused on the promotion of Taiwanese literature and culture to the broader English-speaking world. In that grant, there was a part where they were asking her to create a podcast on aspects of Taiwanese culture, literature, history, society, that sort of thing. And she had not yet arranged how she was going to do that. And she asked me if I would be willing to do that. And I was like, yeah, obviously, of course. I have had the opportunity to create 6 podcasts for them, 2 on Taiwan's history, 4 on different Taiwanese authors. I've just turned all 6 of them over to the museum staff. I'm not sure when they're going to put them out there publicly. I think they're preparing to do that now. I'll put something on the website once they do come out, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Check that every once in a while, and hopefully you'll see it. But don't worry, I'm going to probably do podcast on each of these 4 literary figures and put them on the Chinese Literature Podcast so that Either way, y'all are going to get the benefit of that work. Of course, I'll also be incorporating all of these authors into my Taiwanese literature course. I'm a big believer in why not kill 3 birds with 1 stone if you can. That's it in terms of professional updates. When you listen to this, I'll probably be at my family home in Georgia visiting family for Christmas. I'm also going to get to see Brandon Fultz. Longtime listeners of the podcast know Brandon is a friend of the podcast. On several episodes, many, many years ago, he came onto the podcast. He's a sociologist who does work on China. He's about to finish his PhD. He lives in Louisiana. I'm going to visit him there. We're going to go to New Orleans, and I imagine we'll drink a beer or two. Should be lots of fun. And Rob, the former co-host of this podcast, I actually got to see Rob after 2 years of physical separation. Rob came back to Oregon to see his folks who live in town, and he and I got the chance to have a beer. Rob is doing well. He's thriving in France. He's not as focused on China as he once was, but he has done quite well in France for himself. He is about to open an English language school where he lives. He lives in the exurbs of Paris, and he seems to be just doing fantastically. In terms of updates, that's really all I have. So I'm just going to end it there. As always, check out the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you want to support the podcast, find us on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. Since we don't have a Chinese text, I'm not going to give you a Chengyu. This is going to be a Chengyu-less podcast. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and here's to another fantastic year.